When an officer answers a call about a child wandering alone, it seems like a routine case until the boy says one word to her. What starts as a simple welfare check quickly unravels into a story of heartbreak, betrayal, and a shocking truth that changes everything. Before we dive and tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe in uncovering the truth, hit like and subscribe for more. Naomi Harris adjusted her patrol camp as she stepped out of her cruiser, the afternoon sun glaring off the busy intersection. Her radio crackled faintly in the background as she surveyed the scene. A call had come in about a child wandering alone near the crosswalk. She scanned the area and spotted him, a small boy standing just off the sidewalk, clutching something tightly to his chest. He looked no older than 8, his dark hair unkempt and his oversized jacket hanging awkwardly off his thin frame. A sense of unease settled over Naomi as she approached him, her boots crunching on the gravel. "Hey there, buddy," she called softly, keeping her tone light and non-threatening. "Are you lost?" The boy turned to face her, his wide, anxious eyes locking onto hers. Without hesitation, he darted toward her, nearly tripping over his worn sneakers. Naomi instinctively crouched down to meet him at eye level, bracing herself for whatever was coming. "Mommy," he blurted out, his voice trembling with desperation. Naomi froze, the words hitting her like a blow to the chest. For a moment, she didn't know how to respond. Years of training kicked in, and she forced herself to remain calm. "Hey, it's okay," she said, gently reaching out to Stadium. "Let's figure this out together, okay? What's your name?" "Daniel," he whispered, clutching the creased photograph closer. Naomi studied him carefully. He was shaking his small hand, white-knuckled around whatever he held. "Where are your parents?" "Daniel, do you know where you live?" "I don't want to go back there," he muttered, his voice barely audible. "Back where?" Naomi pressed, trying to piece together his fragmented words. He hesitated, his gaze darting around, as if he feared being overheard. "The foster house." Her mind raced through protocol. This was no ordinary welfare call, and Daniel's words hinted at a much larger story. "Okay, Daniel," she said, her voice steady, "I'm here to help. But first we need to make sure you're safe at the precinct." Naomi led Daniel to a quiet corner in the break room, away from the bustling noise of officers and ringing phones. He stuck close to her, refusing to let go of her hand. Naomi couldn't shake the weight of his earlier words, but she focused on the immediate task of keeping him calm. She set a bottle of water and a granola bar on the table. "Here you go," she said, sliding the items toward him. "You must be hungry." Daniel eyed the food suspiciously, but eventually took a tentative bite. "What's that you're holding?" Naomi asked, nodding toward the photograph. He still clutched tightly its mind, he said, defensively pulling it closer to his chest. "I'm not going to take it from you." Naomi reassured him. "Can I see it? Maybe it'll help me figure out where you came from." After a long pause, Daniel reluctantly handed over the photograph. Naomi's breath caught as she turned it over. The image was slightly faded, but the woman in the picture was unmistakable. She was wearing a police uniform, her smile radiant. Naomi stared at it, her heart pounding in her chest. The woman in the photograph was her younger self. She swallowed hard, willing her hands to remain steady as she handed the photo back to Daniel. "Where did you get this?" she asked, her voice soft. "After now, Miss Carla gave it to me." Daniel said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "She said it's my real mom. She told me to keep it safe and to find her when I could." Naomi sat back, her mind reeling. She wanted to ask more questions, but she could see the exhaustion etched on Daniel's face. She needed help picking up her phone. She called Lisa Grant, a social worker she trusted with difficult cases. "Lisa, I've got a boy here," Naomi began, keeping her voice slow. "His name's Daniel, and he's saying some things that don't add up. I need you to come down here." Lisa arrived within the hour, her non-nonsense demeanor tempered by a kind smile as she approached Daniel. "Hi, Daniel," she said, warmly crouching to his level. "I'm Lisa. I work with kids who need a little help. Can you tell me more about where you've been?" Daniel shrank back, gripping Naomi's hand tighter. "I don't want to go back there," he mumbled. Lisa glanced up Naomi, who gave her a slight nod. "It's okay, Daniel," Lisa said. "No one's going to make you go anywhere you don't want to, but I need to know more so I can figure out how to help you." Daniel shook his head, burying his face in Naomi's side. "Don't leave me," he whispered. Naomi felt a pang of guilt as she looked down at him. "I'm not going anywhere, okay?" she said, her voice firm. "But we need to figure out what's best for you." Lisa straightened, motioning for Naomi to step aside. "He's obviously attached to you," Lisa said in a low voice. "We'll need to take him into protective custody temporarily, but maybe it's best if you stay with him for now, at least until we sort out his placement." Naomi nodded, her stomach twisting. She knew this wasn't standard procedure, but the thought of sending Daniel back to an unknown foster situation felt wrong. That night, Naomi brought Daniel to her apartment. The decision weighed heavily on her, but she told herself it was only temporary. Daniel was quiet during the drive, the photograph still clutched tightly in his hands. When they arrived, Naomi showed him to the small guest room. "This is where you'll stay," she said, flicking on the light. Daniel hesitated in the doorway. "Can I sleep here?" he asked, pointing to the couch. "In the living room." "Why the couch?" "I don't like being alone," he admitted. Naomi sighed and nodded. "Okay, the couch it is." After Daniel had fallen asleep, Naomi sat at her dining table staring at the photograph. The woman's face, her own younger face, stared back at her, stirring memories she had buried long ago. She walked to her bedroom and opened the closet, reaching for a small locked box on the top shelf. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it and pulled out its contents: a tiny keepsake bracelet and a hospital tag. 8 years ago, she had delivered a baby boy. A baby she was told didn't survive. The loss had shattered her marriage and left a hole in her heart that never fully healed. Now, looking at Daniel's sleeping form on her couch, she couldn't ignore the growing suspicion. Could he really be her son? Naomi Harris leaned back in her chair, her gaze fixed on the photograph she'd left on the coffee table. The face, staring back at her, the younger version of herself in uniform, refused to be ignored. Outside, the city was stirring awake, but Naomi's thoughts hadn't rested all night. The boy on her couch had thrown her life into a spiral with just one simple word: mommy. Her police instincts screamed for her to maintain objectivity. This was just a welfare call, a child who needed help, nothing more. But then there was the photograph and the boy's desperation and his unmistakable attachment to her. Even after only a few hours, the sound of stirring in the living room pulled her out of her thoughts. She walked into the room to find Daniel sitting up on the couch, the creased photograph still clutched in his hand. "Good morning," she said, her tone gentle but steady. "How did you sleep?" Daniel shrugged, his eyes darting toward her before dropping to the photograph. "I need to ask you a few more questions today," Naomi continued, sitting on the edge of the coffee table. "Lisa, the lady who came to see you yesterday, is going to help us figure things out. But I need to know more about you first." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Okay, let's start simple. Where do you live?" "Daniel, who takes care of you?" He hesitated, his small fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "The Mitchells," he finally said. "They're my foster family." "Do you like it there?" Naomi asked carefully. Watching his expression, Daniel's shoulders hunched, and he shook his head. "They don't like me." The word struck Naomi harder than she expected. She didn't push further, knowing she'd get more answers soon enough. "Leading, get some breakfast first," she said, motioning toward the kitchen. An hour later, Naomi arrived at the child welfare office. Daniel, into LeGrant, was already waiting for them, her tablet in hand, and her expression neutral but attentive. "Thanks for coming in so early," Lisa said, shaking Naomi's hand before crouching to Daniel's level. "Hi, Daniel. How are you feeling today?" Daniel said nothing, his gaze firmly planted on Naomi. Lisa gave Naomi a meaningful look and gestured toward her office. "Why don't we talk privately for a moment?" Once inside, Naomi wasted no time. "What do we know about his foster family?" she asked, leaning against the desk. Lisa exhaled slowly. "Daniel's been with the Mitchells for about 6 months. They're one of our more experienced foster families, taken in over a dozen kids over the years, but they did call in a missing person report for him yesterday afternoon." Naomi frowned. "They just let him wander off. They claimed he ran away," Lisa explained, her tone measured. "Said it's not the first time. Apparently, he's been having trouble adjusting. And they downplayed how concerned they were. But we've seen this before with high-needs kids. Sometimes families don't handle the pressure well." Naomi's jaw tightened. "Where are their files? I want to know everything." Lisa hesitated, then handed over a thin folder. "This is Daniel's case file. I'll warn you, it's not much. His records start with Bright Futures, a private agency that shut down a few years ago. They were implicated in some ugly stuff, but nothing was ever proven." Naomi flipped through the file, noting the gaps in documentation and the vague language: no birth certificate, no medical history, just a series of placements with the same description: behavioral issues and failure to adapt. "Do you know anything about his biological parents?" Naomi asked, though her voice wavered slightly. "Nothing concrete," Lisa said. Bright Futures was notorious for slop paperwork. Sometimes it feels like they didn't want anyone tracing these kids' histories. The unease Naomi had felt since meeting Daniel deepened. "I need to see the Mitchells," she said, closing the file with a snap. The Mitchells lived in a sprawling suburban home, its immaculate lawn and neatly trimmed hedges starkly contrasting the cold demeanor of the couple who answered the door. Patricia Mitchell, a woman in her late 40s with a sharp gaze, greeted Ed and Naomi with forced politeness. Her husband, Tom, hovered in the background, his arms crossed defensively. We've been through this before, Patricia said. As Naomi stepped into the pristine living room, Daniel is difficult. He doesn't listen, doesn't follow rules. He's been running away since day one. Do you know why he runs? Naomi asked, her tone carefully neutral. Patricia's smile tightened. Because he doesn't want to follow the structure. We provide everything, a roof over his head, at meals, schooling. But he doesn't seem to appreciate it. Naomi glanced around the room. There were no signs of children living there, no toys, no artwork on the walls. It felt more like a showroom than a family home. Where does he sleep? Naomi asked. Patricia gestured toward a small room at the end of the hall. He has his own space. It's more than enough. Naomi walked over and peeked inside. The room was starred with bare walls and a single bed. It felt more like a temporary holding cell than a child's bedroom. When she returned to the living room, Patricia was already on the defensive. Look, Officer Harris, we've done our best. But some kids just don't want to fit in. We can't force him to be part of the family. Naomi's gaze shifted to Daniel, who stood by the door watching the exchange with wary eyes. She noticed how he flinched slightly whenever Patricia moved too close. You seem awfully detached for someone who's supposed to be fostering a child, Naomi said, her voice calm but pointed. Tom stepped forward, his tone clipped. We've taken in plenty of kids, officer. Sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. We can't save them all. Naomi's jaw tightened, but she held her composure. Thank you for your time, she said curtly. We'll be in touch. Back at the precinct, Naomi handed Lisa the file and relayed what she'd observed. Something's not right with that family, she said. Daniel barely reacted to them, and they were more concerned about defending themselves than finding out if he's okay. Lisa sighed. Unfortunately, it's not uncommon. Some families take on multiple kids for the financial incentives and don't provide the emotional support the children need. But unless there is concrete evidence of neglect or abuse, our hands are tied. What about Bright Futures? Naomi asked. If they were involved in Danielle placement, may the problem started there. Lisa nodded. I'll look into it, but that agency's records are a mess. It'll take time to piece anything together. Naomi glanced over at Daniel, who was sitting quietly in the corner, drawing on a notepad. One of the officers had given him the thought of sending him back to the Mitchells made her stomach turn. Do the Mitchells deserve to keep fostering children after how they treated Daniel? Share your thoughts in the comments. And is Daniel truly Naomi's son? How did he end up in the foster care system? Hit that like button and keep watching to uncover the full story. The hum of fluorescent lights filled the quiet space of Naomi's small kitchen. She stood at the counter, stirring a mug of tea absent-mindedly, her thoughts tangled. Daniel was in the living room, sketching on a pad of paper Naomi had found in a drawer. He seemed calm now, though Naomi could still see the tension in his small shoulders, the way his hand hesitated before making each stroke. Her phone buzzed on the counter, jolting her from her thoughts. The name on the screen brought a flicker of relief. Marcus, she said, answering on the first ring. Hey, Naomi, I got your message. Marcus, Lee said, his voice steady. What's going on? She hesitated, glancing toward the living room to ensure Daniel couldn't hear. I need your help. It's complicated, but I have a photograph that might be key to figuring something out. Can you meet me at the precinct tomorrow? Sure, Marcus replied. Without missing a beat, bring the photo, and I'll see what I can dig up. The next morning, Naomi sat across from Marcus in a cluttered precinct office. The photograph lay between them on the desk, its creases softened from years of handling. Marcus picked it up, his analytical eyes scanning the image. This is definitely you, or someone who could be your twin, he said, pointing to the woman in uniform. Where'd you get this? A kid gave it to me, Naomi said cautiously. He thinks I'm his mom. Marcus raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. I know how it sounds, she continued, but look at the badge number on her chest. Marcus adjusted his glasses and leaned closer. That's your old ID number, he said after a moment. This photo's got to be at least 8 years old. Naomi exhaled, slowly, her mind racing. Can you confirm when and where it was taken? Give me a few hours, Marcus said, carefully placing the photograph into a protective sleeve. I'll run it through some tools. Naomi nodded, grateful for his help. Thanks, Marcus. I owe you. When Naomi returned home, she found Daniel sitting on the floor, flipping through a stack of magazines she'd pulled from storage. His face lit up when he saw her. Hi, he said softly, his voice carrying a fragile hope. Hi yourself, Naomi replied, setting her bag on the counter. What are you up to looking at pictures, he said, holding up a glossy page featuring a family on a camping trip. Have you ever gone camping? Naomi sat down across from him. Not much, have you? Daniel shook his head. Miss Carla said, maybe one day we could, but then I had to leave. Naomi tilted her head. Can you tell me more about Miss Carla? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. She was nice. She had a big house and lots of toys. She always said I was special. She gave me the picture and told me to keep it safe. What else did she say? Daniel's brow furrowed in concentration. She said to find my real mom. And then one day some people came and took me away. They said I was going to a new family, but they didn't want me either. Naomi's heart acted. The simplicity of his words, that must have been really hard. She said gently. Daniel nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. I didn't like it that they locked me in my room when I talked about my real mom. Her jaw tightened, anger simmering beneath her calm exterior. You're safe now, she said firmly. No one's going to hurt you anymore. Daniel looked up at her, his eyes wide and searching. Promise? I promise, Naomi said. And she meant it. Later that evening, Naomi sat in her bedroom, the memories of the past flooding her mind again. 8 years ago, she had gone to the hospital full of hope, only to leave with nothing but apologies and a heartbroken explanation. Complications. The doctor had said it's best not to see him. The nurse had added. At the time, Naomi had been too numb to question it, but now as she replayed the details, doubts began to creep in. Why had they been so insistent she not see her baby? Why had the paperwork been rushed? The memory of that day had always felt incomplete, and now with Daniel's presence it loomed larger than ever. She couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. The following day, Marcus called her back to the precinct. He looked up from his laptop as she walked in, his expression serious. I ran the photo through everything I've got, he said, motioning for her to sit. The images from 8 years ago. It was taken just outside your old precinct. Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. And there's something else, Marcus continued, pulling up an enhanced version of the photo. The badge number isn't fake either. This is your badge. Naomi, her mind raced as she processed the information. But how? I don't remember ever taking this photo. Could be someone else took it, Marcus suggested, or it could have been staged for some reason. Staged for what? Naomi asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. Marcus leaned back in his chair. That's what we need to find out. The precinct was quieter than usual when Naomi walked in the early morning light, slanting through the high windows. Her mind was buzzing with questions, each one more unsettling than the last. Marcus had texted her late last night, hinting that he had uncovered something major about Bright Futures. Naomi found him in a corner of the precinct's tech room, his workstation a clutter of monitors, and has scribbled notes. You look like you haven't slept, Naomi said, dropping her bag on a nearby chair. Marcus glanced up, his eyes shadowed but focused. You're not wrong, but you'll want to see this. He swiveled his chair toward a monitor displaying rows of scanned documents and financial spreadsheets. Bright Futures wasn't just a shady adoption agency. It was a front for something much bigger. Naomi leaned over his shoulders, squinting at the screen. Bigger. How? They weren't just matching kids with families, they were trafficking infants. This wasn't some one-off case of shady paperwork. It was an operation. Marcus clicked through the files, highlighting payment records. Look here. They funneled money to hospital staff, lawyers, and even foster care evaluators. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was coordinated. Naomi's stomach churned as she studied the records. The names of hospitals she recognized jumped out at her, including one that had been under scrutiny years ago for mishandling patient files. How many babies are we talking about? Dozens at least, possibly more, Marcus said grimly. I've been cross-referencing their financials with reports of missing or stillborn infants from those hospitals. The pattern's clear. Bright Futures was paying off hospital staff to falsify records and make the babies disappear. Then they turn around and sell those babies under the guise of private adoptions. Naomi took a step back, her pulse racing. And you think Daniel? Marcus met her eyes. I think it's highly likely. That afternoon, Naomi met Lisa Grant in her office. The social worker had reluctantly agreed to share more of Daniel's case file, though her unease was palpable. I'm not supposed to let you see this, Lisa admitted, flipping through the file, but I understand why you need to. Nah stayed silent as Lisa placed a photocopied report in front of her. The document detailed Daniel's placement history, starting with the Henderson. They were his first foster family. Lisa said, her voice tinged with bitterness. Bright Futures placed him with them when he was just a few months old. He didn't stay long. Naomi scanned the file, her jaw tightening at the notes, cried excessively. Poor adjustment returned after 3 months. So they sent him back because he cried too much. Naomi's voice was low but laced with anger. Lisa nodded, folding her hands in her lap. The Henderson were notorious for taking in kids, collecting the checks, and returning them when things got inconvenient. Daniel wasn't the first, and he wasn't the last Naomi felt a surge of anger she couldn't suppress. How did no one stop them? Because the system doesn't stop people like the Hendersons. Lisa said, her voice tight. They followed the rules on paper, and that was enough to keep them in the foster network. Naomi sat back, the weight of the revelation pressing down on her and Bright Futures. What did they have to do with the Hendersons? Lisa hesitated, then slid another document across the desk. They were part of the same network. Bright Futures placed children with families like the Hendersons to keep their operation running smoothly. The fewer questions asked, the better. Later that evening, Naomi sat at her kitchen table surrounded by the documents. Marcus and Lisa had provided the names and dates blurred together, a web of corruption that seemed almost too vast to comprehend. As she sifted through the files, one name caught her attention. Evelyn Porter. The name was attached to an old complaint filed against Bright Futures by a hospital nurse. The complaint, buried deep in the records, accused the agency of illegal practices, including falsifying medical records and coercing vulnerable mothers into giving up their children. Naomi's breath hitched as she read the details. Evelyn Porter had worked at Riverside Memorial, the same hospital where Naomi had given birth. Her hands shook as she reached for her phone and dialed Lisa. Lisa, this nurse Evelyn Porter. Do you know where she is now? Lisa sighed. On the other end of the line, she retired years ago, but I think she's still in town. Why? She worked at the hospital where I had my baby, Naomi said, her voice barely above a whisper. I need to talk to her. Naomi was still processing the significance of Evelyn Porter's name when she found an envelope taped to her front door. Later that night, the handwriting was unfamiliar, and there was no return address. She opened it cautiously, her instincts on high alert. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a chilling message: stop digging, or you'll regret it. Her blood ran cold as she stared at the words. Whoever had sent the letter knew she was looking into Bright Futures, and they didn't want her to continue. Naomi folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. She wasn't sure who she was up against, but she knew one thing for certain: she couldn't back down now. Naomi pulled up to the edge of a quiet, unassuming street. The house ahead looked worn, but maintained a small one-story structure with chipped white paint and a sagging porch. It was tucked behind an overgrown hedge, as if trying to hide from the world. She checked the address on her phone. One last time, Evelyn Porter. The name alone stirred unease in her gut. This woman had been a nurse at Riverside Memorial 8 years ago, and if the records were accurate, she might hold the answers Naomi desperately needed. Taking a steadying breath, Naomi stepped out of her car and approached the door. Her hand hovered over the knocker for a moment before she rapped twice. A shuffling noise came from inside, followed by the faint creak of footsteps. The door opened just a crack, revealing a frail woman with sharp, wary eyes behind thick glasses. Yes, Evelyn asked, her voice guarded. Evelyn Porter. Naomi asked, show her badge. I'm Officer Naomi Harris. I was hoping to talk to you about your time at Riverside Memorial Hospital. Evelyn's face paled. I've been retired for years. I don't know anything about that place anymore. Naomi held up her hands in a gesture of reassurance. I'm not here to accuse you of anything. I just need some information. It's about a case I'm working on. Evelyn hesitated, glancing over Naomi's shoulder as if expecting someone to be watching. Finally, she sighed and opened the door wider. Come in. But I can't promise I'll have anything to say. The inside of the house was modest, but tidy, filled with old furniture and faded photographs on the walls. Evelyn motioned for Naomi to sit at the small dining table. While she shuffled into the kitchen to fetch tea, Naomi waited, her eyes scanning the room. The quiet hum of an old refrigerator filled the air, and the only other sound was a faint ticking of a wall clock. Evelyn returned with 2 mismatched mugs and set them down on the table. She took a seat across from Naomi, her hands trembling slightly as she queued her tea. What do you want to know? Naomi reached into her bag and pulled out the photograph. She placed it gently on the table, sliding it toward Evelyn. Do you recognize this? Evelyn's reaction was immediate. Her face crumpled, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. Where did you get this? She whispered. It was given to me by a little boy named Daniel, Naomi said softly. He says I'm his mother. Evelyn's shoulders sagged, and she let out a shaky breath. I hoped I'd never see that picture again, she murmured, but I knew it might come back someday. Naomi leaned forward, her heart pounding. Evelyn, I need the truth. Did you work with Bright Futures? The older woman's eyes filled with tears. I didn't have a choice, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. They had people everywhere: hospital administrators, doctors, even some nurses. If you Didn't cooperate, you lost your job. Or worse, what happened to Daniel? Naomi pressed her voice, tightening with emotion. What happened to my baby? Evelyn looked away, her hands gripping the edge of the table. It was 8 years ago. She began. You came in for an emergency C-section. There were complications, at least. That's what they told you, but the truth is your baby was healthy. Naomi felt like the air had been knocked out of her lungs. What do you mean? Healthy, they told me. He was stillborn. Evelyn's eyes met, hers filled with regret. That's what they wanted you to believe. They sedated you heavily after the surgery and told he didn't make it. But I knew it wasn't true. I saw him. He was alive, crying, perfectly healthy. Naomi's hands clenched in a fist on the table. Why didn't you say anything? I tried, Evelyn said, her voice breaking. But they silenced anyone who spoke up. The hospital was working with Bright Futures to traffic babies, selling them to families willing to pay a fortune. You were just another mother they targeted. Naomi, you were vulnerable, alone, and they thought you wouldn't fight back. Tears burned in Naomi's eyes, but she fought to stay composed. And Daniel, how did he end up in the foster system? Evelyn took a deep breath, as if bracing herself. I couldn't stop what they were doing, but I couldn't let him disappear completely. I kept the photograph and put it with him. When they placed him in the system, it was all I could do to give him a chance to find you someday. Naomi's voice was trembling now. You knew this was wrong. Why didn't you go to the police? They own everything, Evelyn said bitterly. The hospital, the agency, even some of the courts. I was one nurse against an entire network. I didn't have the power to stop them. All I could do was keep records, hoping someone like you would come along and piece it together. Evelyn stood slowly and shuffled to a small cabinet in the corner of the room. She opened it and retrieved a worn folder, its edges frayed with age. She placed it on the table in front of Naomi. These are the records I kept, she said quietly. Names, dates, payments, everything I could document without getting caught. I don't know if it's enough to bring them down, but it's a start. Naomi opened the folder with shaking hands. Inside were photocopies of hospital logs, financial ledgers, and handwritten notes. She scanned the pages, her anger growing with each revelation. This Implic hospital administrators, Bright Futures executives, even a few judges. Naomi said, her voice hard. Why didn't you come forward with this before? Evelyn looked down at her hands. I was scared, she admitted, but I'm not scared anymore. If it means helping you and Daniel, I'll testify. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right. Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. Thank you, Evelyn. This might be what we need to finally take them down. As Naomi drove home that night, the weight of Evelyn's confession settled heavily on her shoulders. The pieces were starting to fit together, but the picture they formed was more horrifying than she had imagined. When she walked into her apartment, Daniel was waiting for her, his small frame curled up on the couch. He looked up as she entered, his eyes lighting up. Hi, Naomi, he said, his voice soft. Hi, Daniel, she replied, kneeling in front of him. I talked to someone who knows a lot about you. She told me how brave you are. Daniel tilted his head, curious. Who? Naomi smiled faintly. A nurse who used to take care of you. She said you kept this picture safe because you're special. Daniel's face lit up with a small, shy smile. Miss Carla always said I was special. You are, Naomi said firmly, and I promise we're going to figure this out together. As Daniel settled back into the couch, Naomi sat beside him, the weight of Evelyn's revelations pressing against her. The fight ahead would be dangerous, but she knew one thing for certain: she wouldn't stop until the truth was fully uncovered. The morning air was heavy with unspoken urgency as Naomi sifted through Evelyn's documents. At her kitchen table, stacks of photocopied hospital records, ledgers, and handwritten notes were spread out before her. But one name kept appearing, circled in Evelyn's cramped handwriting: Miss Carla. Naomi traced the letters with her finger, the name tugging at something in the back of her mind. Miss Carla, Naomi murmured aloud, leaning back in her chair. Who are you, and what do you know? Across from her, Marcus Lee adjusted his laptop on the cluttered table. He had been typing furiously for the past hour, cross-referencing Evelyn's files with public records. His coffee sat untouched, forgotten in the flurry of his church. Lisa Grant, perched on the edge of a chair nearby, glanced over her shoulder at Marcus. Any luck? Yet Lisa asked, her tone edged with impatience. She had spent the previous evening sorting through Bright Future's connections to Daniel's placements, but her efforts had only deepened the mystery. Marcus frowned a little. Miss Carla's full name is Carla Jenkins. She was a licensed foster parent for about 5 years before her license was revoked. Evelyn mentioned her multiple times in connection with Daniel. Why was her license revoked? Naomi asked, narrowing her eyes. That's where it gets messy, Marcus said, turning his laptop toward them. On the screen was a scanned copy of an official report. According to the records, she was accused of neglect and unfit living conditions, but the dates don't add up, and the complaints came shortly after she filed reports against Bright Futures looks like they railroaded her to shut her up. S brow furrowed. It's a pattern we've seen before. Bright Futures silenced the whistleblowers by discrediting them. They made sure anyone who challenged them wouldn't be taken seriously. Naomi let out a slow breath, her thoughts churning. So Carla cared for Daniel, tried to protect him, and paid the price for it. Marcus nodded. She didn't just care for him. Evelyn's note suggests she was the one who gave Daniel the photograph she told him to keep. It's safe. A lump formed in Naomi's throat as she glanced at the photograph sitting beside the documents, Daniel's lifeline. Where is she now? That's the tricky part, Marcus said, scratching the back of his neck. After losing her license, she disappeared, changed her name, moved to a rural area. But I've been digging, and I think I found her. She's living in a small town about 3 hours from here. Goes by the name Carla Hayes. Lisa looked at Naomi, concerned, flickering in her eyes. Are you sure about this tracking? Her down might spook her. She's been hiding. She probably doesn't trust strangers. Naomi's jaw tightened. I don't have a choice. She might be the only person who knows the truth about what happened to Daniel. That afternoon, Naomi found Daniel in the living room building a precarious tower of blocks. His brow was furrowed in concentration, but he glanced up as she entered. His face softened into a shy smile. Hey, buddy, Naomi said, sitting down beside him. Can I ask you something? Daniel nodded, setting down. A block, okay.